There is a question that has haunted psychologists, historians, and ordinary people for decades. It is a question so uncomfortable that most people instinctively reject it before seriously considering it. The question is this: how can one person convince hundreds, thousands, or even millions of others to abandon their own judgment and blindly follow them? Most people believe they would never fall for such manipulation. They imagine themselves standing on the outside, looking in with perfect clarity. They picture cult members as gullible, weak, desperate, or somehow different from normal people. But this assumption contains a dangerous flaw. The truth is that cults are rarely built by preying on stupidity. In fact, some of history's most infamous cults were filled with intelligent, educated, and seemingly rational individuals. People with careers, families, degrees, ambitions. People who looked exactly like everyone else. And that should concern you, because if intelligence alone protected people from manipulation, cults would not exist. If education alone made someone immune, entire communities would never have surrendered their freedom to charismatic leaders. Yet history shows the opposite. Again and again, ordinary people have handed over their trust, their money, their relationships, and sometimes even their lives to someone who promised them certainty. The story usually begins the same way. A person appears who seems to possess answers. They speak with confidence. They radiate certainty. They understand people's fears, frustrations, and desires. They know exactly what others want to hear. They offer something incredibly valuable: meaning. And meaning is one of the most powerful drugs in existence. Human beings can tolerate pain. They can survive hardship. They can endure uncertainty for remarkable lengths of time. But meaninglessness is a different kind of suffering. It creates a void, a feeling that something important is missing. And when people feel lost, confused, disconnected, or dissatisfied, they naturally begin searching for someone who appears to know the way. This is where cult leaders thrive. Contrary to popular belief, most cult leaders do not begin by demanding obedience. They begin by offering hope. Imagine someone who feels invisible. Perhaps they have struggled their entire life to fit in. Maybe they feel misunderstood by their family. Maybe they are disappointed by society. Then one day, they encounter a group that welcomes them with open arms. People smile at them, listen to them, tell them they matter. Suddenly, they feel seen. For the first time in a long time, they belong. This experience is incredibly powerful because humans are social creatures. Throughout most of history, survival depended on belonging to a tribe. Being rejected by the group often meant death. As a result, our brains evolved to value acceptance at a very deep level. We crave connection more than we realize. Cult leaders understand this instinct better than most psychologists. Before they manipulate people, they make people feel special. They create an environment where newcomers experience warmth, validation, and attention. The individual feels chosen, important, unique. The group appears different from the rest of society, better somehow, more enlightened, more awake. At first, nothing seems suspicious. In fact, many cults initially resemble self-help groups, spiritual communities, social movements, or support networks. The dangerous elements emerge slowly, often so gradually that members barely notice the transformation. This is because human beings are much more likely to accept drastic changes when they happen in small steps. Imagine someone asking you to jump from the ground floor of a building to the roof in a single leap. Impossible. But if they build a staircase, you can climb one step at a time without noticing how high you've gone. Manipulation works the same way. The first request is small. Attend a meeting, read a book, spend time with the group. Then another request appears, and another. Each step feels reasonable because it is only slightly more demanding than the previous one. Psychologists call this gradual escalation. Cult leaders have mastered it. They know that people rarely surrender their freedom all at once. Freedom is surrendered inch by inch, choice by choice, decision by decision. And perhaps the most terrifying part is that the individual usually believes every step was their own decision. This illusion of choice is one of the most powerful weapons a cult leader possesses. Rather than forcing obedience, they create conditions that make obedience feel voluntary. Members begin convincing themselves. They defend the group, rationalize questionable behavior, ignore warning signs. Over time, their identity becomes increasingly tied to the organization.
And once identity becomes involved, logic often takes a back seat. Think about how difficult it is for someone to admit they have been wrong about something important. Now imagine admitting that your entire worldview was built on a lie. Imagine acknowledging that years of your life, your relationships, your sacrifices, and your beliefs were manipulated by another person. That realization is emotionally devastating. So, instead of questioning the leader, many people double down. The deeper someone becomes invested, the harder it becomes to leave. This creates a psychological trap. Every sacrifice increases commitment. Every commitment increases loyalty. Every act of loyalty makes future obedience easier. Soon, the leader is no longer simply a leader. They become the source of truth. And once a person reaches that stage, something fascinating begins to happen. Their perception of reality starts changing. Facts become less important than belief. Evidence becomes less important than loyalty. Questions become threats. Doubt becomes betrayal. The world gradually divides into two groups, those who understand the truth and those who do not. This is not accidental. One of the first things cult leaders do is create an enemy. Sometimes it is society, sometimes the government, sometimes outsiders, sometimes former members. The specific target does not matter. What matters is creating a clear distinction between us and them. Humans are naturally tribal. We instinctively categorize people into groups. Once this process begins, loyalty to the group often becomes stronger than loyalty to objective reality. The leader reinforces this division constantly. The outside world becomes dangerous, misguided, corrupt, evil. The group becomes safe, pure, enlightened. Every criticism from outsiders is reframed as proof that the group is right. Every warning becomes evidence of persecution. Every contradiction becomes confirmation. This creates a self-sealing system where no amount of evidence can easily break through. And this is where the true genius of cult leaders begins to reveal itself. Because their greatest talent is not controlling behavior, their greatest talent is controlling perception. When someone controls how you interpret reality, they no longer need to force obedience. Obedience happens naturally. The person begins policing themselves. They monitor their thoughts, suppress their doubts, avoid uncomfortable questions, defend beliefs they once would have laughed at, and all the while, they believe they are acting freely. But perhaps the most chilling fact about cult leaders is that many of them genuinely believe their own stories. Not all cult leaders see themselves as villains. Some see themselves as saviors. Some see themselves as prophets. Some see themselves as visionaries destined to change the world. And this belief makes them even more dangerous, because people who think they are saving humanity often justify actions that would otherwise seem unthinkable. History is filled with examples of leaders who committed extraordinary harm while convincing themselves they were doing good. The question is not whether such people exist. The question is why human beings keep following them. And to answer that, we need to look deeper. Not at the leaders themselves, but at the hidden psychological mechanisms inside every human mind. Because the forces that create cult followers are not rare abnormalities. They are universal human tendencies. And once you understand them, you may start seeing them everywhere. Most people imagine cult leaders as possessing some kind of supernatural ability to control minds. They picture charismatic figures capable of hypnotizing crowds and forcing intelligent people to abandon common sense. But the reality is far more unsettling. Cult leaders do not succeed because they have extraordinary powers. They succeed because they understand ordinary human psychology better than most people understand themselves.
The same vulnerabilities they exploit in their followers exist in every one of us. The difference is that cult leaders know exactly where those weaknesses are and how to use them. At the center of their strategy lies a simple truth about human nature. People crave certainty. Life is filled with confusion, unpredictability, and unanswered questions. We don't know what the future holds. We don't know why certain things happen. We often struggle to understand our purpose, our place in society, or even our own emotions. Living with uncertainty is uncomfortable. It creates anxiety. It forces us to confront the possibility that we don't have all the answers. For many people, that discomfort becomes unbearable. And when someone arrives claiming to possess absolute truth, the offer becomes incredibly tempting.
This is one of the first advantages cult leaders possess. They never present themselves as individuals who are searching for answers. They present themselves as individuals who have already found them. While scientists, philosophers, and psychologists acknowledge complexity and uncertainty, cult leaders do the opposite. They offer simple explanations for complicated problems. They tell people exactly why they are suffering, exactly who is responsible, and exactly what must be done. Suddenly, a confusing world starts to feel understandable. The chaos of life is transformed into a story with clear heroes, clear villains, and clear solutions. And because the human mind naturally prefers certainty over ambiguity, many people find themselves drawn toward that certainty before they even realize what is happening. But certainty alone is not enough to create devotion. If cults were built purely on ideas, people could simply leave whenever those ideas stopped making sense. What truly binds members to a cult is not logic, but emotion. Cult leaders understand that human beings are emotional creatures first and rational creatures second. We like to believe we make decisions based on evidence and reason, but in reality, emotions often lead the way. We feel something first, and then we create explanations afterward. Cult leaders know this, which is why they focus less on convincing people intellectually and more on connecting with them emotionally. They make people feel understood. They make people feel important. They make people feel accepted. Someone who has spent years feeling invisible suddenly finds themselves surrounded by people who listen to them, encourage them, and treat them as though they matter. For the first time in a long time, they feel like they belong somewhere. That feeling can be incredibly powerful, because belonging is not merely a social desire, it is a psychological need. Human beings evolved in tribes where acceptance meant survival. Being rejected by the group could have deadly consequences. Even today, our brains respond strongly to social inclusion and exclusion. We are wired to seek connection. This is why cult leaders invest so much effort into creating a strong sense of community. Over time, the group becomes more than a collection of people. It becomes a family. Members spend increasing amounts of time together. They attend meetings, participate in activities, and build deep relationships with one another. Gradually, their social world begins to revolve around the group. Friends outside the organization become less significant. Family members may become distant. Outside influences start feeling unnecessary. Before long, the group becomes the center of the member's life. At that point, leaving becomes much harder than outsiders realize. From the outside, it may seem obvious that someone should walk away from a manipulative leader. But leaving often means losing far more than a belief system. It means losing friendships, community, support, and identity. It means walking away from the people who have become your entire world. The fear of that loss can be overwhelming. Many members remain loyal not because they fully believe everything the leader says, but because they cannot imagine life without the relationships and sense of belonging the group provides. Cult leaders strengthen this dependency by slowly convincing members that the outside world is dangerous. Family members who express concern are portrayed as enemies. Critics are described as ignorant or malicious. Former members become examples of betrayal. Over time, a subtle message takes root. Only the group truly understands you. Only the group can protect you. Only the group can provide meaning. This creates an invisible wall between members and the rest of society. The higher that wall becomes, the harder it is for alternative viewpoints to break through. Another weapon cult leaders use is repetition.
Human beings are heavily influenced by familiarity. The more often we hear something, the more likely we are to accept it as true. Psychologists call this the illusory truth effect. A statement does not become true simply because it is repeated, but repetition makes it feel true. Cult leaders take advantage of this tendency by constantly reinforcing the same messages. Day after day, members hear that the leader is wise, that the group is special, that outsiders cannot be trusted, and that their mission is essential. At first, these ideas may seem questionable, but after hearing them hundreds of times, they begin to feel normal. Familiarity slowly transforms into belief. Over time, members stop evaluating these ideas critically. They stop asking whether the claims are supported by evidence. The beliefs become automatic, woven into their understanding of reality.
What once seemed extraordinary now feels obvious. What once seemed questionable now feels undeniable. And because these beliefs are constantly reinforced by the surrounding community, they grow stronger with every passing day. Perhaps the most fascinating psychological mechanism cult leaders exploit is the relationship between sacrifice and commitment. Human beings have a powerful tendency to value things more highly when they have invested heavily in them. Imagine spending years supporting a cause, donating money, dedicating your time, and defending it against criticism. Then, imagine discovering that the entire thing was based on deception. Accepting that truth would be emotionally devastating. It would mean admitting that years of effort, trust, and sacrifice were misplaced. For many people, that realization feels unbearable. This is where cognitive dissonance enters the picture. Cognitive dissonance occurs when reality clashes with deeply held beliefs. The resulting discomfort creates pressure to resolve the conflict. Ideally, people would examine the evidence and adjust their beliefs accordingly. But human psychology does not always work that way. Often, it feels easier to reinterpret reality than to abandon a belief that has become part of one's identity. Instead of questioning the leader, members search for explanations that preserve their faith. Failed predictions are reinterpreted. Contradictions are rationalized. Warning signs are ignored. The more someone has invested, the stronger this tendency becomes. This helps explain why some cults survive events that should logically destroy them. A leader makes a dramatic prediction. The prediction fails. Outsiders expect members to leave. Yet many become even more devoted than before. The reason is simple. Admitting the truth would require confronting painful emotions that people naturally want to avoid. The mind begins searching for alternative explanations, not because those explanations are convincing, but because they are emotionally easier to accept. The uncomfortable reality is that this tendency is not limited to cults. It appears in politics, religion, relationships, businesses, and countless other areas of life. Human beings often cling to beliefs not because those beliefs are true, but because abandoning them feels too painful. Cult leaders simply understand this aspect of psychology and use it to their advantage. By the time a member begins experiencing serious doubts, the trap is often already closed. They have invested too much time, too much energy, too much trust, and too much of their identity. Walking away no longer feels like changing an opinion. It feels like destroying a part of themselves. And that is precisely why cult leaders are so effective. They do not merely convince people to believe something, they convince people to become something. Once belief becomes identity, control becomes far easier than most people could ever imagine. And yet, even these psychological tools are not the most powerful weapon in a cult leader's arsenal. There is one final method, a method so effective that it can cause people to distrust their own instincts, ignore their own observations, and surrender their own judgment. It is the ability to reshape reality itself. And once a leader gains control over how followers interpret reality, escaping their influence becomes far more difficult than anyone expects. The most dangerous thing a cult leader can take from a person is not their money, their freedom, or even their relationships. The most dangerous thing they can take is their ability to trust their own perception of reality. Once that ability disappears, manipulation reaches an entirely different level. At that point, followers no longer need constant supervision. because they begin enforcing the leader's worldview themselves. The prison no longer exists around them. It exists inside them. To understand how this happens, imagine that every day you are surrounded by people who repeat the same message. They tell you what is true, what is false, who can be trusted, and who cannot. At first, you may question some of these claims. You may notice contradictions. You may feel moments of doubt. But every time those doubts appear, dozens of people around you confidently insist that your doubts are the problem. They reassure you that the leader is right. They tell you that your confusion is evidence that you need to trust the process. Slowly, almost without noticing, you begin questioning yourself instead of questioning the group.
This process is far more common than most people realize. Human beings naturally look to others when determining what is real. Psychologists call this social proof. When uncertainty exists, we often assume that the behavior of the group reflects the correct answer. If everyone around us appears confident, we become more likely to suppress our own doubts. This tendency helps explain why crowds can influence individual judgment so dramatically. Even when people privately suspect something is wrong, they often remain silent because nobody else seems willing to speak. Cult leaders understand this principle perfectly. They create environments where agreement appears universal. Members constantly hear stories about the leader's wisdom, the group's success, and the importance of the mission. Alternative perspectives become increasingly rare. As a result, doubts that would normally grow stronger begin to weaken. The individual starts wondering whether they are the one who is mistaken. The group's confidence becomes more convincing than their own observations. This creates a psychological phenomenon that can be incredibly difficult to escape. Once someone begins distrusting their own judgment, they become dependent on external authority to interpret reality. Every uncertainty requires guidance. Every question requires approval. Every decision requires validation. The leader gradually becomes the lens through which followers view the world. What makes this process especially dangerous is that it rarely feels oppressive. In fact, many followers experience it as a relief. Making decisions is exhausting. Uncertainty is stressful. Doubt is uncomfortable. When someone else claims to have all the answers, the burden of thinking for yourself begins to disappear. Responsibility feels lighter. Complexity feels simpler. The world becomes easier to navigate. But there is a hidden cost. Every time a person hands over responsibility for their thinking, they surrender a piece of their independence. At first, the sacrifice seems small, then it grows. Eventually, followers stop asking whether the leader's claims are true. They focus instead on whether the claims align with the group's beliefs. Truth becomes secondary to loyalty. History offers countless examples of where this can lead. Some of the most destructive cults in history did not begin with violence or extremism. They began with small compromises. Followers accepted minor distortions of reality because they trusted the leader. Then, they accepted larger distortions. Over time, beliefs that once seemed absurd became normal. Actions that once seemed unthinkable became justified. This gradual transformation reveals something deeply unsettling about human psychology. Most people assume dramatic changes happen suddenly. They imagine a clear moment when someone crosses a moral line. But reality is rarely that simple. Human beings adapt. We normalize. We adjust. What feels shocking today can feel ordinary tomorrow if exposure happens slowly enough. Cult leaders exploit this tendency masterfully. They understand that people are far more likely to accept extreme ideas if those ideas are introduced gradually. Each new belief is only slightly more radical than the one before it. Each step feels reasonable when viewed in isolation. Followers rarely notice how far they have traveled because they focus on the current step rather than the entire journey. Imagine standing at the bottom of a mountain. Looking at the summit might feel overwhelming, but if you focus only on the next few feet, the climb feels manageable. Cult leaders use the same strategy with belief systems. Followers are never asked to accept the final destination immediately. They are simply asked to take one more step, and then another, and another, until one day
they find themselves somewhere they never imagined they would be. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of this process is how effectively it can override morality. Most people like to believe their values are fixed. They assume they would never participate in harmful behavior. They imagine themselves resisting pressure and standing up for what is right. Yet, psychological research repeatedly suggests otherwise. Under certain conditions, ordinary individuals can be persuaded to do extraordinary things. One of the most famous examples is the Milgram experiment. Participants believed they were administering painful electric shocks to another person. Despite obvious signs of distress from the supposed victim, many continued simply because an authority figure instructed them to do so. The experiment revealed a disturbing truth. People are often far more obedient than they realize. Cult leaders rely heavily on this tendency.
Once followers view the leader as an unquestionable authority, obedience becomes easier. Actions are no longer judged solely on their own merits. Instead, they are evaluated based on who requested them. If the leader approves, followers become more willing to comply. Personal responsibility begins to fade. This creates a dangerous psychological shift. Rather than asking, "Is this right?" followers start asking, "Does the leader want this?" Morality becomes outsourced. Ethical decisions are delegated to someone else. And when enough people surrender their judgment simultaneously, almost anything becomes possible. Yet obedience alone does not fully explain the power cult leaders hold. Their greatest success often comes from controlling identity itself. Human beings do not simply hold beliefs. They build identities around those beliefs. Over time, the line between what someone believes and who they are begins to blur. This distinction matters because changing a belief is relatively easy. Changing an identity is much harder. If someone tells you that one of your opinions is wrong, you may feel defensive. But if someone challenges an identity you have built over years, the reaction becomes far more intense. It feels personal. It feels threatening. It feels like an attack on your existence. Cult leaders deliberately fuse belief with identity. Followers stop seeing themselves as individuals who belong to a group. They begin seeing the group as an essential part of who they are. Their purpose, relationships, values, and self-worth become intertwined with the organization. Leaving no longer means abandoning an idea. It means abandoning a version of themselves. This is why many former cult members describe leaving as one of the most painful experiences of their lives. They are not simply changing their minds. They are rebuilding their entire identity from scratch. Everything they once believed about themselves must be questioned. Every assumption must be re-examined. Every certainty must be replaced with uncertainty. For some people, that challenge feels impossible, and that is exactly why cult leaders work so hard to prevent followers from questioning reality. They know that the moment someone begins trusting their own observations again, the illusion starts to crack. The moment someone feels comfortable asking difficult questions, control begins to weaken. The moment someone realizes they are allowed to think independently, the leader's influence starts to fade. Because, despite all their manipulation, all their charisma, and all their psychological tricks, cult leaders ultimately depend on one fragile condition. Followers must continue believing that the leader's version of reality is more trustworthy than their own. The moment that belief collapses, everything changes. And in the final part of this story, we will explore the most important question of all: how people escape. How individuals who once surrendered their judgment reclaim it. How they break free from psychological control. And perhaps most importantly, what the existence of cult leaders reveals about every human mind, including yours. If there is one thing that terrifies a cult leader more than criticism, more than bad publicity, and more than outside investigations, it is a follower who begins asking questions. Not hostile questions, not rebellious questions, just honest ones. Because every cult, no matter how powerful it appears from the outside, rests upon a fragile foundation. It depends on people accepting a version of reality without examining it too closely. The moment genuine curiosity returns, cracks begin to form. What makes this so difficult is that leaving a cult is rarely a dramatic event. Hollywood often portrays escape as a sudden awakening, a moment when someone discovers the truth and immediately walks away. Real life is usually much messier. The process often begins with a small inconsistency, a statement that doesn't make sense, a prediction that fails, a contradiction that refuses to disappear. Something feels wrong, even if the person cannot fully explain why. At first, many followers try to suppress these doubts. They tell themselves they are overthinking. They convince themselves that the leader knows more than they do. They search for explanations that preserve the worldview they have spent years building. But some doubts are persistent. They linger in the background. They return during quiet moments. And over time, they grow stronger.
This is because reality has a remarkable quality. No matter how carefully it is hidden, it eventually pushes back. A person can ignore contradictions for a while. They can rationalize uncomfortable truths. They can silence their instincts. But maintaining a false reality requires constant effort. Eventually, the mental strain becomes exhausting. Many former cult members describe a period where they felt trapped between two worlds. One part of them wanted to believe. The other part could no longer ignore what they were seeing. Every new contradiction added pressure. Every unanswered question made the situation harder to sustain. The mind found itself fighting a battle against itself. And then comes the most difficult stage of all, the realization. Not the realization that the leader was wrong, not even the realization that the group was manipulative. The hardest realization is recognizing how much of yourself became attached to the illusion. Suddenly, the person is forced to confront a painful possibility. What if the thing that gave my life meaning was never what I thought it was? For many people, this moment feels devastating. They may experience guilt, shame, anger, grief, and confusion all at once. Years of trust appear misplaced. Sacrifices seem wasted. Relationships become complicated. Some lose entire communities overnight. Others lose family members who remain loyal to the group. The emotional cost can be enormous. This is why leaving often requires extraordinary courage. Contrary to popular belief, former cult members are not weak people who suddenly became strong. Many of them were strong all along. The difference is that they finally chose uncertainty over false certainty. They accepted the discomfort of not having all the answers, rather than continuing to live inside a comforting illusion. And that decision is far more difficult than most people realize. Human beings naturally prefer certainty. We want clear explanations. We want simple stories. We want someone to tell us who we are, what matters, and where we belong. Cult leaders understand this desire and build entire systems around it. But true growth often begins where certainty ends. The person who leaves a cult is forced to rediscover something that many people never fully develop in the first place: independent thinking. Independent thinking does not mean rejecting every authority figure. It does not mean becoming cynical or distrusting everyone. It means maintaining the ability to question. It means being willing to examine evidence even when that evidence challenges your beliefs. It means understanding that confidence and truth are not the same thing. This lesson extends far beyond cults, because the uncomfortable truth is that cult psychology does not exist only inside isolated compounds or fringe movements. The same psychological mechanisms appear throughout society. They appear in politics, they appear in online communities, they appear in corporations, social movements, ideologies, and even personal relationships. Whenever people stop questioning and start blindly following, the seeds of cult psychology begin to grow. That is what makes this topic so unsettling. Most people watch documentaries about cults and think, how could anyone fall for that? But perhaps the more important question is, under the right circumstances, could I? The honest answer is probably more uncomfortable than we would like. Every human being possesses the psychological vulnerabilities that cult leaders exploit. We all seek belonging. We all crave certainty. We all fear rejection.
We all have biases. We all want meaning. These traits are not flaws. They are part of being human. The danger arises when those natural desires overpower our ability to think critically. History repeatedly demonstrates that intelligence alone is not enough. Some of the smartest people in the world have fallen under the influence of manipulative leaders. Education is not enough. Success is not enough. Skepticism is not enough. The belief that it could never happen to me may actually be one of the greatest risks of all. The strongest defense against manipulation is not intelligence. It is humility. The humility to admit that you can be wrong. The humility to question your assumptions. The humility to recognize that certainty can sometimes be dangerous. Because cult leaders thrive in environments where people stop questioning. They flourish when doubt becomes taboo. They gain power when loyalty becomes more important than truth. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson hidden inside every cult story. The real battle is not between cult leaders and their followers. The real battle exists inside every human mind. It is the battle between certainty and curiosity, between comfort and truth, between belonging and independent thought. Every day, people face smaller versions of this struggle. They choose whether to examine information critically or accept it blindly. They choose whether to follow the crowd or think for themselves. They choose whether to challenge comforting beliefs or protect them. Most of these choices seem insignificant in the moment, but over time, they shape the kind of person someone becomes.
A cult leader's greatest weapon is not charisma. It is the human desire to stop thinking. And a free mind's greatest weapon is not knowledge. It is the willingness to keep questioning. So the next time you encounter someone who claims to possess all the answers, someone who insists that only they understand the truth, someone who discourages questions and rewards blind loyalty, pay attention. Not because they are necessarily a cult leader, but because the psychology is the same. Real truth does not fear questions. Real wisdom does not demand obedience. Real understanding does not require you to surrender your ability to think. The most dangerous leaders in history convinced people to stop trusting themselves. The strongest individuals learn how to trust themselves without closing their minds. And perhaps that is the final irony of cult psychology. The people who escape are not the ones who find all the answers. They are the ones who rediscover the courage to keep asking questions. Because freedom is not knowing everything. Freedom is having the right to think for yourself.